Now I'd like to introduce Michael McGerty to the presence here at Beacon Hill. Michael is going to give us his presentation on his trips to Europe and the Mideast. Thank you very much for coming to us, Michael. And let's give him a big hand, a big welcome hand for Michael.
Hello? Can everyone hear me okay? Yes. All right, well, quite a bit of applause for you guys not exactly knowing what I had to say yet, but hopefully that's a good thing. My name is Michael McGerty. I live right here in Lombard, and I went to Glen Westlake Middle School up the street. Right now, I'm a freshman in high school. These odd-looking people that you may see around the room are my dad, companion in my world travels, my mom, two of my grandparents, and anyone else who may be back there. Before anything else, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd also like to thank your wonderful activities director, Mr. Mark Rabin, for hosting me here and doing all the real work behind the scenes. This has been in the works for a while now, ever since I approached him about giving a talk on my travels. A few years ago, I started traveling the world with my dad, and since then we've been to the countries of Israel, Jordan, Egypt, England, France, Italy, and Germany. During that time, we've taken over 3,400 pictures. You'll be glad to know that I didn't bring all of them. My goal today is to give you an overview of all the countries I visited, so I've worked hard narrowing down that 3,400 to the very best 100. I'd first like to talk briefly about the countries of England, France, and Italy, which I visited during my Europe trip. Then I'd like to talk in more detail about the countries of Israel, Jordan, and Egypt, which I visited when I went to the Middle East. Although I have plenty of material, I figured that I should talk to you guys for no more than an hour. As such, I've narrowed it down to my very best hour of material and recorded myself to make sure I didn't go over the time limit. Feel free to stop me at any time if you have questions. My goal today is to give you the reason I'm here is both because, and my goal today, the reason I'm here is both because I love sharing my travel stories and because I want to learn to be a better speaker. Thank you for helping me with that. I'm very excited about talking to you guys today, as you have a wonderful facility here, and it looks like a really wonderful crowd. Still, I'm no professional, so please be nice to me if I'm still learning. Now, are there any questions before I begin? All right, then let's get started. The first city we visited is London. Now behind me you can see the center of power in London, Parliament. Here, this tower is the very famous clock tower, Big Ben. Over there, that rectangular tower is the Tower of Records. I thought this was interesting. The Tower of Records is actually where they keep paper records for parliamentary dealings for hundreds of years, and they still do today. Here is me with our Londonian guide, John Going. He helped as my guide for the historical sites, but also as my interpreter for the English language. People say that they speak the same language over there, but they really don't. Here we are in front of the very famous Buckingham Palace, home of the Queen of England. It's 4 stories high. It has a huge public square out front and manicured gardens out back. It's really not a bad place to live. I wouldn't mind living in a place like that. I don't know about you guys. Here we are now on the prime meridian of the world. This picture, I like this picture because the prime meridian actually divides the world in two. So we're actually straddling both the east and the west hemispheres. This is also where all the time zones of the world are set from. Here you can see me underneath a Spitfire, the fighter plane. We are in the Imperial War Museum in London. Now, when we travel, we usually travel to see the history. We also travel with a very limited time frame, so we're always rushing to the next site. We'll get up before dawn, get back after dark, and always be running around trying to get one more site in. The point is, the last thing we wanted to see in London was the Imperial War Museum. But it was going to close, and we were running out of time, so we were desperate. We ended up sprinting off the train, grabbing our camera and making a mad dash through the streets of London to get there. We arrived just 5 minutes before it closed, which was pretty satisfying. And we got some good pictures with all the great stuff in the museum's collection. The next city we visited was Paris. You probably all recognize this image. Here we are at the very famous Eiffel Tower, Le Tour Eiffel. It's 3 stories high. You can see the 3 levels there. We went all the way to the top, where it is very windy, but you get a great view. I also like wandering around in the legs there, where you can see all the crisscrossing ironwork and the heavy supports that really make something like this possible. Sorry, everyone. Yes. Here we are on the 3rd floor of the Eiffel Tower, Le Sommet, enjoying the magnificent views over Paris. We're in the Place de la Concorde in Paris now. Here you can see an obelisk. It's actually a real Egyptian obelisk brought from Egypt and put up in this square. Remember that for later in my talk. There will also be a multiple choice test handed out afterwards, so it might be a good idea to take notes. I'm just kidding. Another very famous Parisian monument, the Louvre Museum. That is the very famous glass pyramid out front. Now, it is an art museum, and I'm usually not a big art fan, but we made time for this museum because it is the home of the Mona Lisa. It's always crowded by people, so you had to kind of shoulder your way through the crowd to get there. And it's on a gigantic wall, completely swarmed by crowds, completely covered in this huge sheet of bulletproof glass. Here is me. I'm that little tiny figure in front there, in front of Notre Dame du Paris. I really am giving it scale this time. The Cathedral of Notre Dame is huge up close. Here I am now, in front of Café Procope. Don't you just love those French words? Café Procope. This isn't really one of the monuments that you hear about a lot, or one of the real famous ones, but I like it and I included it. It's actually the oldest cafe in the world. Because it's so old, famous people from the last few centuries have hung out there, including Napoleon, Thomas Jefferson, and Voltaire, the French revolutionary. One thing I thought was interesting is that Voltaire reportedly drank 26 cups of coffee a day there. So for me, it's no wonder he was getting all those revolutionary ideas in his head. The huge, imposing, and fear-inducing Palace of Versailles. The equally huge, imposing, and fear-inducing lines in front of Versailles. After Paris, the next city we visited was Nice. Nice is on the southeast coast of France, on the Côte d'Azur. that is kind of like the vacation-y party zone of France where all the wealthy businessmen go. Because of that, there's not a whole lot of things to see there. I told you we traveled to see the history, and there wasn't a whole lot of that in Nice. Still, we were tired from our 5 days of touring so far. We had been, like I told you, getting up before dawn, getting back after dark, running around. You can imagine that one of us here liked the running slightly more than the other one. But the point is, when we got to Nice, we were tired. So it's possible that the first day I may have slept until 12:30 in the afternoon. Here you can see my dad reminding me that the morning is gone. The next country we visited was Italy, and the first city in Italy we visited is Venice. I love Venice. Venice is a great place just from the historical significance and just being a nice town to be in. Venice is an island city. It's completely crisscrossed by canals. So the first thing you have to know about Venice is that Venice loves boats. There's boats everywhere. They have boats for everything that you can think of. Here is a vaporetti, or a motorized bus boat. It's actually the public transport system of Venice. You can hop on at one station and go along and then hop off at another. And we use that a lot to get around the city. Here is a police boat. They'll pull you over if you go over the speed boating limit. Just kidding. And here is a fireboat. Apparently they have fires in cities that are completely covered by water. But hey, who's to judge? Before we went to Venice, I actually got an opportunity to do a project on whatever I wanted for my school. I could pick any topic that I wanted and just become an expert on that particular topic. Since I knew that we were going to Europe and Venice, I decided that I would become an expert on Venice, and more specifically, the Doge of Venice. The Doge was kind of like the elected king of Venice during the time when it was a city-state. I spent around 3 months then studying all of the fantastic Venetian history and the story behind the Doge before we went here. It was really cool to be able to know all that history and then be able to go there and be on the places where it actually was and where the Doge actually was. Here behind me, this pink rectangular building that you can see is the Doge's palace where he lived. Inside the Doge's palace, the grand staircase where he received his visitors. Now, since I knew so much about the Doge, and here I was where the Doge was, I decided, hey, I should be the Doge. So I was. Here is me receiving my visitors at the top of the grand staircase that I showed you before. Here is me receiving the visitors that I am more friendly with. The key is the chin. Yeah, I got a few odd looks for that. This is a picture of the Bridge of Sighs. The story behind it is that the Doge's prisoners would cross from his palace over there to his prisons over here, where you did not want to be. Then they would cross over that little bridge and look through the windows at last upon the free world and sigh, knowing they would not see beauty again. This is the Bridge of Sighs in real life, completely covered by billboards. I was very angry. I'm going to have to write a very strongly worded letter to the Venetian government. I just included this picture because I look handsome. The closest you get to a traffic jam in Venice, a gondola jam. Here you can see the Rialto Bridge. It's the largest bridge in Venice over the Grand Canal, which winds through the center of the city. Because Venice is an island city, they eat lots of seafood. Fish are a really big part of the Venetian lifestyle. Because of that, you can really get a good feel for the city and the beating, pulsating spirit of the city by going to the fish markets. We went to the fish markets to see some of that Venetian culture. While we were wandering through, we found a box of snails. That's what those are. They're little tiny snails. But the one thing the Venetians didn't anticipate about the snails was that they would try to escape. I don't know if you could see, but those guys are going over the side there. They're going for freedom. The next thing you had to know about Venice is that it floods. And when it floods, it floods. The public squares are covered. They had to put around little walkways to get around. You have to put on those little rubber boots to get around in the water. Of course, I just ran around in the water anyway and got soaked, which may or may not have been a good idea. But the point is, most tourists are annoyed when the flood comes because it makes it harder to get around. I, though, consider myself lucky to have been there at a time of flood. I got to see more of the real spirit of Venice, underwater. Here I am on top of St. Mark's Basilica. I'm actually in between the 4 horses of St. Mark, which are very famous. We are looking out over St. Mark's Square, which is the central square of Venice, in front of the Basilica, which is kind of the heart of the city. Now, I told you about my inclination to be the Doge, and it did sometimes get me into trouble. Here, this is theoretically where the Doge would have addressed the crowds in St. Mark's Square from. So I figured, hey, why don't I try addressing the crowds? But the moral of this story is that you're not supposed to cross those little railings that they have set up there, or else an Italian guard will come out and yell at you for a long time in Italian. That is the story of how I will be negatively received if I ever go back to St. Mark's Basilica. The second city we visited in Italy, and the second to last in Europe, was Florence. You can immediately tell the difference between Florence and Venice because of the color scheme. In Venice, they like the lighter colors, the pinks and the blues. In Florence, though, they like the yellows and the browns and the reds and the more earthy colors. Here I am in front of the main river in Florence, the Arno. This is me in front of the Duomo Cathedral, a very famous cathedral in Florence. It's one of my favorite monuments in the world just to look at. I really love the huge dome and just the architecture of the building in general. Here in front, you can see this octagonal building is the baptistry, which actually predates the cathedral. Here we are inside the baptistry, looking up at the magnificent painted ceilings. One thing I thought was interesting is that most medieval people were illiterate, so they had to get the Bible in some other way besides reading it. One of those ways was through pictures, like this one. Can anyone tell what the scene is here? Would anyone like to take a guess?
The Ascension?
That's close. It's actually the Last Judgment. Here you can see Christ in the center, determining who will go to heaven on the left and hell on the right. Hell is a place you don't want to go. I didn't know if you could see, but that demon has a guy in his mouth. Here I am petting the nose of the Florentine pig. It's supposed to give you good luck and ensure that you return to Florence again in your life, which I intend to. Catching some much-needed sleep on the train. The next city we visited was Rome. Rome is a busy city. It's a modern city. But it's also a fantastic city to visit. There's all sorts of historical and culturally significant sites there. Here's me in front of one of the more famous, St. Peter's Basilica. It is the head church of the Catholic faith and also the residence of the head of the Catholic faith, Supreme Pontiff and Vicar of Christ, the Pope. He lives in a little building off to the side there. Now, he got a lot of coverage lately when the existing Pope resigned and a new one had to be elected, Pope Francis I. We were there a long time before that happened, though. The very imposing lines in front of St. Peter's. I don't know if you're noticing a theme here. This is an obelisk in front of St. Peter's. Obelisks are a big theme in Rome. This is, again, a real Egyptian obelisk, like the one in Paris that I showed you. One thing that I thought was interesting is that Romans really love obelisks. There are actually, nowadays, more obelisks, Egyptian obelisks, in Rome than there are in Egypt. Here we are now inside St. Peter's Basilica, in front of that magnificent carved altar. If you go straight to that altar, to the very center of the church, straight down and a little over to the side, you would actually find the bones of St. Peter, the companion of Jesus. I thought that was cool that they actually built St. Peter's Church on top of the traditional burial site of St. Peter. Here's me with our Italian guide, Marta. Unfortunately, this is the best picture I could get for the Sistine Chapel, because there's no photographs allowed inside. But it really is magnificent. Now we leave the more modern and Christian part of Jerusalem and go into the more ancient and Roman part of Jerusalem. I'm sorry, did I say Jerusalem? We'll be getting to that in a second. Rome. We're in Rome. Pretty sure we're in Rome anyway. This is the Roman Forum, where everything that was happening happened in ancient times. Here's the Colosseum. Very famous. Home of gladiator duels. Here we are now inside the Colosseum. Our last day in Rome was also our last day in Europe. We were going to leave the next day to fly back to Chicago. There was one last thing we wanted to see in Rome, and that was the Church of San Giovanni in Laterano, a very cool place that unfortunately I didn't have time to include. But we were lost. We thought we could find our way through Rome on our own, and we were wrong. And if Italians as a group have many redeeming qualities, which they do, giving directions is not necessarily one of them. It's okay if any of you out there are Italian. I'm Irish. You can make fun of me, too. The point is, wandering the back streets of Rome ended up not being so bad after all. It turned out to be a pretty cool experience. This is a pigeon that we found when we were wandering the back streets of Rome. It's a very special pigeon. You could see it on a water fountain there. And while we were watching, it actually ducked down its head and it started drinking out of the water fountain. It just was slurping out of the water fountain with its beak. I thought this was just crazy. I didn't know pigeons could do that. We ended up watching it for probably 20 minutes, and it became one of the things I more vividly remember from our Europe trip. Oh, I am going crazy, aren't I? And then, sadly, we had to leave, and our travel adventures came to a close for now. Are there any questions before I move on to the Middle East? Is there anything that I haven't made clear? Anyone? Okay. We visited 3 countries in the Middle East. Oh, yes? Question?
Where did you stay in all of those? Did you stay in hotels or?
Yeah, hotels, generally. Any other questions? Okay. So we visited 3 countries in the Middle East: Israel, Jordan, and Egypt. All of those countries have their own fascinating histories and their own stories. The first country we visited, though, was Israel. Here you can see me in my bathing suit and sunglasses. Very stylish. I'm in front of this sign that says -422. That stands for -422 meters, the lowest point on the surface of the Earth, which is the Dead Sea. You can see the Dead Sea out behind me there. One thing I thought was interesting is that because it's the lowest point on Earth, the water goes in, but it has no way to get out besides to evaporate, which leaves all the salt behind. You all know that salt makes you float, so you float like a cork in the Dead Sea. Of course, we knew this beforehand, and we had seen pictures, but nothing really prepares you for going in. You walk in, and the water feels normal, and then you lay back, and it is like laying on a bed. It is a surreal experience. That's no magic trick, folks. That's science. Here I am in the more relaxed pose favored by most people. Now here I am in the less traditional Superman pose. It's slightly less popular because you risk dunking your face into the water and having your eyes burn for several hours with the salt. But hey, anything for a picture. In order to get to the Dead Sea, we had to go through the West Bank. The West Bank is kind of one of the words you hear about a lot with Israel on the news. It's part of Palestine. Palestine and Israel haven't always had the best relationship, so there's a lot of conflict here. That snake-like thing that you can see back there is actually the wall that the Israelis have built to isolate the Palestinians. It's very controversial. I thought it was just interesting to be able to see this connection to modern events and modern politics while we were on our trip. Here I am in front of the Church of the Annunciation in Nazareth. Nazareth is the town where Jesus traditionally grew up. This church is the Church of the Annunciation. It's called that because it is built over the spot where God traditionally annunciate to Mary that she would have Jesus. Now, I have to say traditionally because scholars aren't really sure where any of these events actually happened. So just know that in the future when I'm talking about a religious site and I say that it happened in a particular location, I mean according to tradition. The point is, I like this particular church because here in Lombard, or in America, we build churches just to go to. But there, in the Middle East, they can actually build churches over the real biblical sites. Here I am at another very famous biblical site, the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus walked on water, calmed the storm, and gathered a whole lot of his disciples in the Bible. In order to get there, we only had to walk past the very heavy security of the restaurant, which included guards armed with submachine guns and attack dogs. But it ended up being a very unique and very memorable experience. This is a terrain model of the Golan Heights. That's another one of the real news buzzwords that you hear about a lot with Israel. It's been the site of a lot of wars in the past century between Israel and Syria. While we were exploring northern Israel, we actually got an opportunity to drive up here into the Golan Heights. I thought that was a unique experience to be able to see the modern history of Israel as well as the ancient history while we were there. Danger mines. That's not the nice kind that dig stuff out of the ground either. They're the kind that explode. It's written in 3 languages, English, Hebrew, and Arabic, so that everyone can understand it. It just is another reminder that this area could become a war zone at any time. After we explored northern Israel, we came down into the holy city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem has been argued by some to be the center of the world. It is, bar none, my favorite city in the entire world that I've ever been to. It's just a wonderful place that's filled with so many sites of historical and religious significance. It's really unbelievable. I think this is a good overview of the city of Jerusalem. There, in the upper right-hand corner, that golden dome you can see is the Dome of the Rock. That's the 3rd holiest shrine in the world for all Muslims. Over there, those blue domes next to my head are the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. That's the holiest place in the world for all Christians, regardless of denomination. If you go back to the Dome of the Rock, straight down and a little over to the right, then you would find the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, which is the holiest spot in the world for all Jews. Now, if you wonder why there's so much conflict in this part of the world, here you have the holy sites of 3 different religions all packed into the same city. Here is me and my dad in front of the Western Wall. It's, like I said, the holiest spot in the world for all those of the Jewish faith. What I think is interesting is that there's nothing actually holy about the wall in itself. It's called the Western Wall because at one point it was the western retaining wall of the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is essentially a large rectangular platform on which the Jewish temple once stood. Now, though, that the Jewish temple is destroyed and the Muslims occupy the top of the Temple Mount, this is the closest that Jewish people can get to the Holy of Holies, which is where God's presence is believed to rest on earth. Here I am. I'm in a lot of these pictures. I don't know if you've noticed. Here I am on the Mount of Olives, something you hear about a lot in conjunction with Jerusalem. We're looking out over the city of Jerusalem. These white boxy things that you can see down the whole side of the hill are actually Jewish graves. The Mount of Olives is something that you hear about a lot with Christian significance, so it seemed odd to me that there would be so many Jewish graves here. It turns out, though, that there's a valley very close to here where God is going to come, according to Jewish tradition, to judge the world. Therefore, these people will be the first to be resurrected. Here in Lombard, we might have to wait a little while, folks. Sorry. Here is us in front of the Dome of the Rock. It is the 3rd holiest place in the world for Muslims. The reason it's called the Dome of the Rock is because if you went in those little doors there, you would actually find a huge rock spread out on the ground in front of you. That rock is, again traditionally, held to be where Abraham nearly sacrificed his son Isaac. That's important because that is where God made his covenant with man. Unfortunately, nowadays you can't go inside there, but I do want to go inside there one day and see the rock. This is a picture of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It is the holiest spot in the world for all Christians. That's because it's built over the site of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. What I think is interesting is that it's not actually the grandest church. I showed you St. Peter's and the Duomo. They're both more grand than this is, even though this is more holy. Another thing that I thought was cool is that because it's so holy, it can't be given to any one single denomination of Christianity. If you go inside, it's actually divided among 6. The Catholics have their own little territory within the church, and so do the Eastern Orthodox and the Coptics and the Syrians and everyone else. Here I am inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, in front of the Roman Catholic altar over Golgotha. Golgotha means, in Hebrew, the place of the skull. Translated into Latin, that's Calvary. So this is actually the altar over the hill of Calvary. Right back there is where Jesus of Nazareth hung in agony and died. It's a very holy place. It's a very somber place. If you go over there and you go under that altar, there's actually a little porthole that you can stick your arm through and feel the rock where the cross was raised. This is very holy. In the single holiest church in Christendom, this is the most sacred spot. This is the tomb of Jesus Christ. It is where, in the Bible, Jesus was laid to rest, the stone was rolled in front of the tomb, and after 3 days, he rose again, which we just celebrated as Easter. It's a very moving experience to be able to go inside. So I consider myself lucky to have been able to go in there, even only for a minute. Are there any questions now before I move on? Is there anything that I could clear up? Yes?
Were there soldiers or anyone watching you because you were in such a...
In the tomb? No.
No, such a disputed area?
Oh, in the Golan Heights?
Oh, with the Muslims, the Christians?
Yeah, she asked if there were any soldiers in Jerusalem, and there are Israeli soldiers in Jerusalem. Not necessarily all over, though. They're not in the holy sites, but they do kind of keep watch over the peace while they're in the city. Any more questions? All right, then. This is another picture of the Mount of Olives. It's kind of the reverse of our previous picture because we are on the Temple Mount looking out at the Mount of Olives. I think this picture is a good overview of the mount. Over there, that small building that you may be able to see is the Church of Dominus Flevit, which I will explain in a second. Up here in the corner is the Church of Pater Noster, which is Latin for Our Father, where Jesus traditionally taught the disciples the Our Father prayer. This whole white expanse down the side of the mountain is just thousands upon thousands of Jewish graves. Here we are now inside the Church of Dominus Flevit. I am silhouetted here against the skyline. The Church of, well, Dominus Flevit in Latin means the Lord wept. It's called that because in the Bible, when Jesus was going over the Mount of Olives to come into the city of Jerusalem, he saw the temple. He then knelt and wept, foreseeing its future destruction. I think the symbolism of this church is very powerful because inside the church it's kind of dark and you can't see very much. It looks out straight at the Dome of the Rock, which is the closest approximation that scholars have to where the Jewish temple actually stood. Now we forego the more religious and somber section of Jerusalem and go into the more bustling hubbub section of Jerusalem, the markets. this is kind of where daily life goes on, and you can get a really good feel for the city here. Here I am wandering through some of the covered stalls of the markets. Now, in Europe, you could usually identify me because of my blonde hair. In the Middle East, though, you can usually identify me by the hat that I'm wearing. I really like that hat. It's kind of like a baseball cap, except it has this protective shield down the back. That shield protects you from the sun, so it's very useful in places where there are a lot of sun. Because of that, I call it the Desert Adventure Hat. And it's possible that because I liked it so much, I may have worn it a little too much. And you'll see me wearing it in almost every one of these pictures. This is what it looks like. Everyone likes corn on the cob, apparently including Arabs. That is, everyone except me. Braces. This is something else we came across while we were wandering through the markets. It's actually the Arab approximation of a Pizza Hut. It's a street stall selling pizza. We were just wandering through looking for the historical sites when we ran into this. We figured, hey, it's around lunchtime, so why don't we eat here? That may or may not have been a good idea, since we could have gotten horribly sick from the Middle Eastern germs, but we ended up fine, and it ended up not being bad pizza. This is another thing that we found while we were wandering through the markets, the spice shop. It's something uniquely Middle Eastern, a shop that only sells spices. Honestly, in the Middle East, people are into things that I didn't even know you could be into. These people are very excited about selling their spices. It was cool for me to be able to go in and see just the hundreds of varieties. I grew up over here thinking that spices came in a little red bottle labeled Tabasco. It was a unique cultural experience then to be able to see this. Here I am with some of the hundreds of varieties of spices. They have a little model Dome of the Rock there next to the oregano. I think this picture really defines Jerusalem. It's not of any of the major monuments or of the religious sites. It's just of kids playing soccer. That may not seem important at first, and it really didn't seem important to me at the time. But now, when I see this picture, it really strikes me that, hey, people live here. There are people who live out every day of their lives in the city of Jerusalem. They could go to pray at the Western Wall, or they could have a picnic on the Mount of Olives. It was cool for me to be able to see that it wasn't just us Western tourists with our cameras snapping pictures of all the major sites, but that this is a real place where people really live. The second country in the Middle East that we visited was Jordan. Going from Israel to Jordan is like going back in time. It is crazy. On the Israeli side, everything is chic and shiny and modern. Then you go on to the Jordanian side, and there are little fuzzy black and white televisions and old Arab men puffing cigars. It's like going 50 years into the past. I think it's kind of actually reminiscent of the British Empire days. Not that they traveled through time during the British Empire. The way we saw Jordan was different as well. In Israel, we were on a tour bus with 30 or 40 other people, so we had to we didn't really get to see too much by ourselves. When we got to Jordan, though, a lot of the people who were with our tour in Israel dropped off because they were scared. There had been a lot of violence around then in Syria, which is neighboring to Jordan, that you might have heard about. But Jordan itself is fine. Still, most of the people were afraid to go there. It ended up that we met our guide, and we were just supposed to drive around Jordan in the back of his car. That was a little weird at first, and actually a little scary to be just driving around a foreign country in the back of this guy's sedan. Eventually, though, I realized that it gave us a cool kind of locals perspective on Jordan, and I value the experience. Here I am in front of the Dana restaurant. It's not really that important in itself, except that it serves Italian food. Here we are in the middle of Jordan, and they're serving Italian food. I thought this was pretty crazy. It turns out, I guess, that Jordanians just really love Italian food. I think that's cool, because that's one of those things that you just really can't know without going there. The story behind this picture is that we were touring a castle in northern Jordan called Karak. While we were touring, I had to go to the bathroom, so we went out into the town looking for a bathroom. We're asking people, and they're trying to help, but they don't speak very good English. Some of them are pointing this way, and some of them are pointing this way, and some are waving their arms like this. We're really not sure where we should go. Then we meet this guy, and he says, "Hey, you can use the bathroom in my shop." So I do, and then we end up striking up a conversation with him. After a few minutes, he gets to really liking me. So he asks if he can take a picture with me. My dad says, "Sure," and I'm like, "Yeah, I'm not sure about that." But we take the picture. He puts his arms around me, which creeps me out a little bit, but the picture turns out okay. Right after we take this picture, he grabs me by both shoulders and he kisses me on the head. He just kisses me right on the forehead. At this point, I am freaking out. I have no idea what's going on. I'm thinking, I met this guy 5 minutes ago, and now he is kissing me on the forehead. Eventually, though, when I calmed down, I realized that I guess Jordanians are just more affectionate than American men, and they are clearly willing to show it. Now, I consider it one of my lifetime achievements to have been kissed by a Jordanian man. After that, we voyaged down to the lost city of Petra. Petra is a very famous, very iconic place, and this is its most iconic image, the treasury. Now, how many of you have seen the movie Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade? Okay, that's a few of you. How many of you have at least heard of Indiana Jones? Okay, there's a few more. The point is, during the movie, Indiana Jones is looking for the Holy Grail. He goes down this long, narrow corridor called the Sick, and then he comes out and he sees this treasury before him. He goes inside, he meets challenges from God, and eventually he finds the Holy Grail. Now, unfortunately, in real life, there's none of that inside. It's just a kind of blank box room. But they really did use this historical site for the filming. It was cool then to be able to see this in the movie and then be able to go there and see it in real life. This is that dark, narrow canyon I was talking about, the Sick. It's kind of winding and you can't really see where you are. And it goes on for a while. Then you see this light ahead of you, and you come out and it is just dazzling. It opens up and you see the magnificent treasury in front of you. It's just a really cool aesthetic effect to go from that dark and narrow to suddenly the huge building. Any more questions before I move on to Egypt? Yes?
Petra is really hard to get to, and the people who live there would stand on top, of that narrow pass and collect taxes from the tribes using that passageway or as a shortcut. That's what I got of our trip.
Well, they weren't there. Yeah, thanks. Well, they weren't there when we were there. Yeah, in the ancient times, they did use that as a passageway. So, anyway, The last country we visited, and the last country I will be talking about today, is Egypt. Egypt is just a fantastic place. This is a very recognizable image, the Pyramids of Giza. Now I think it's just ridiculous to think about when these things were constructed. They were built, these particular ones, around 2500 BC. That's 4,500 years ago. To put that in perspective, these things had been here for 1,000 years when Moses left Egypt. Here we are in front of the Great Pyramid of Khufu. The Great Pyramid of Khufu. It's spelled like Khufu, but you had to say it with an accent and kind of roll your knees forward. Khufu. This is the tallest of the three pyramids. Here we are in front of the Pyramid of Khafra. The Pyramid of Khafra. Sometimes it gives the illusion of being taller than the Pyramid of Khufu because of this intact limestone casing on top. But in reality, it's the second tallest of the three. Here we are now, going inside the Great Pyramid of Khufu. Now, somebody asked me the other day, how many licks does it take to get to the center of a pyramid? No, that didn't really happen. But if it did, you would be the first ones I told. The point is, we are now going inside the Pyramid of Khufu. It is a very cool place. I didn't really know what was inside a pyramid until I started researching. There's a long descending corridor. Then there's a long ascending corridor. At the end of all that, there's a box room that is the pharaoh's burial chamber. Nowadays, it's just blank walled and there's nothing in there. But it's really cool to be able to be in there and stand where the pharaoh was, in the very heart of the pyramid. Here's me, my dad, and the third person we got to agree to take a picture with us, the Sphinx. The mysterious cat lion pharaoh still watches over the Giza plateau. One of the more unique and well-advertised Middle Eastern experiences is riding a camel. We weren't too excited to ride a camel, though. I thought, hey, where's the history? It's just a big furry animal. But we ended up doing it because it was included in our tour, and it ended up being a really cool experience. They're up high, so you can sort of see everywhere. This, however, is the most dangerous part of getting on a camel, the act of getting on. First, it stands up with its back legs, and you go flying forward. Then it stands up with its front legs, and you go flying back. But if you can hold on for dear life through all that, you get some really cool pictures. I never get tired of looking at this picture. All three pyramids, me, and a camel. Now, here's me with our Egyptian guide, Marwa. Before going on one of these trips, I do a lot of preparation beforehand. So, before we went to the Middle East, I actually spent around 6 months outside of school just studying all the Middle Eastern history and the Middle Eastern culture. I like to do that because this is a once-in-a-lifetime trip, and when I'm there, I want to know what I'm seeing. Because of that background, though, I ended up having some really good conversations with our Egyptologist guide, Marwa. It ended up being one of the really unique Middle Eastern experiences we had to be able to talk with a real Egyptologist about Egyptian history on the sites where it actually happened. Now, I told you, on Israel we were on a tour bus. In Jordan we were in the back of a guy's car. In Egypt, it was so bad that even the people who were planning to go on to Egypt actually canceled. They were afraid of the Egyptian revolution that you may have heard about a few years ago. We went a few months after the revolution, but there was still a lot of turmoil in the region. When we got there, though, because we were the only ones, we ended up with our own driver, coordinator and Egyptologist guide. The very most important part of that was the Egyptologist guide, because I learned a lot about Egyptian history by talking to her. Cairo is busy. If I thought Rome was busy, I was in for a surprise when we got to Cairo. A huge chunk of the Egyptian population lives there. It's something like a third. The streets are always jammed. If you can believe it, they actually get by without using streetlights in Cairo. There are no streetlights anywhere. You just kind of go when you go, and the rest of the time it's gridlock. That made it a little scary to get around the city, but it ended up being a very unique Cairo experience. This gives new meaning to yield to pedestrians. Getting to the pyramids, almost as much of an adrenaline rush as seeing them. That bus appears to be trying to turn into oncoming traffic. I haven't taken driver's ed yet, but I'm pretty sure that that's not a good idea. Donkey cart, a common mode of transportation. I really like this picture. I know I say that a lot, but I really, really like this picture. If you guys remember nothing else from Egypt except the pyramids and this picture, I'll be happy. We're actually inside Djoser's necropolis, home of the oldest pyramid in the world, the Step Pyramid. What's important about this picture, though, is that behind me are 40 stone columns. They're actually the first 40 stone columns ever erected on Earth. They're the first 40 stone columns that anyone put up anywhere in the history of mankind. I thought this was just mind-boggling. It's amazing to me to think that people actually had to invent things that seem as intuitive to us as columns. This was their great experiment. Now, I ran up and down and counted them to make sure there were 40, and there are, so you're not getting gypped of any columns. We spent 3 days in Egypt. Our first day up in Cairo, second day down south in Luxor, and the third day up in Cairo. Here we are in front of the Valley of the Kings. The Valley of the Kings, what's interesting about it is that by now, when they built this, the pyramids had been around for a while, and they were just getting robbed like crazy. So the pharaohs actually dug their tombs as shafts into the mountainside and hid them instead. We were able to go in some of those shaft tombs and see all the magnificent paintings and the carvings and the decoration. It's really cool. One of the more famous tombs we went in was actually the tomb of King Tut. Here is me and our Luxor guide in front of the Nile River. He didn't kiss me, if you were wondering. Here we are in front of another very famous Luxor monument, the Temple of Karnak. We're in front of an obelisk pedestal. An obelisk pedestal is basically a giant stand that they put an obelisk on. What's important about this obelisk pedestal, though, is that this is the obelisk pedestal for the obelisk that now stands in the Place de la Concorde in Paris. So if you guys can all remember back to the beginning of my talk, when I told you to remember that obelisk in Paris, this was what it was for. We took these trips a year apart. We went to Europe 1 year and the Middle East a full year later. So it was cool for me to be able to see that connection across time between our two trips. The obelisk was once here in Luxor, and now it is there in Paris. Here is another place that I was looking for, an obelisk pedestal. This one was for the obelisk that now stands in the San Giovanni in Laterano Church in Rome. I was unable to find it, though. If any of you ever go to Egypt and you find it, you had to tell me, okay? Here is me with one of the Karnak Temple soldier guards. They're basically just soldiers that are assigned to guard places. But what's unique about the Karnak Temple guards is that they don't necessarily guard anything. As soon as they're assigned to guard a place, some of them just open up their own ticket booth for bakshish. Bakshish is essentially the Egyptian version of tipping. Now, I hope you don't mind if I use the word bribery, but that was what it seemed like to me at first. Gradually, though, I began to realize that this might not be so bad after all. This is just how things work. For only a few dollars, we could get a guard to show us around some of the sites of historical significance and get into some of the cool places. Here's a picture of me with one of our guard friends who showed us around. The picture is made much more effectual when you can see this submachine gun he has slung over his shoulder. When we returned to Cairo for our last day, we went back to the pyramids at sunset, and we got some really good pictures. No, I'm just kidding. This was actually a poster on the wall of Luxor Airport. Looks good, doesn't it? Our last day in Cairo, we spent visiting the city of Cairo. Here you can see the Mosque of Muhammad Ali. I really like the aesthetic quality of this mosque. I like how it looks with all the domes and the minarets. Here we are now inside the Mosque of Muhammad Ali. Not the boxer, if you were wondering. It's actually Muhammad Ali, the Pasha of Egypt at one time. Inside a mosque, you have to take your shoes off out of respect. So I'm here barefoot in this picture. It's an active place of worship where people are praying. But as long as you don't disrupt the worshipers, they don't mind if you go inside. We did. And we sit down on the ground with our guide, Marwa. She just says, ask me whatever you want about Islam. Ask me anything that you've ever wanted to know. So we do. We end up having a really great conversation with her about Islam and what it stands for. It ended up being one of the really memorable Middle Eastern experiences then, to be able to have a conversation about Islam with a real Muslim in a functioning mosque in Cairo. Here I am in front of the Egyptian Museum, that pink building you can see behind me. It has a fantastic collection, but just as important is the fact that it's located on Tahrir Square. With the Egyptian Revolution, you may have heard about Tahrir Square. That was kind of the focal point of all of the protests. Some clashes with police actually went on there. You could imagine then that we had a little bit of a time telling my good mother here that we were going to visit Tahrir Square. We really did go back to the pyramids at sunset this time. This is a real picture. It was our last day in Cairo and our last day in the Middle East. We were going to go back home. Because of that, we wanted to end it on a good note. We wanted to have one last really valuable experience. So we decided to return to the pyramids one last time to see the sound and light show. When it got dark, they actually projected images and sounds onto the side of the pyramid. They used the physical face of the pyramid as a giant projector, kind of like I'm using this now. It was a really great show. But even more, it gave us an excuse to go back to the pyramids, which is always worth it. And then, finally, we had to go back home, and our travel adventures came to a close. But we came back with a lot of great memories and a determination to share them with the community. Thank you. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Yes.
Yes?
How would they get the boulders that were so huge to build a pyramid?
She asked how they managed to get the huge stones to construct the pyramids with. The method the pyramids were constructed is actually, people aren't really sure how the pyramids were constructed. But they think that the stones were dragged over some kind of rollers, like logs or something, by workers. Since they didn't have wheels, they would just use some kind of thing to make it slide or roll along on. Other than that, no one's really sure how they got the blocks on top of each other to make the pyramids. It's still very mysterious. Mr. Nagus?
Michael, I enjoyed your presentation greatly. Nice job.
Thank you very much.
Where are you off to next? What adventure beckons you now?
He asked where we were going next. Our next trip, we actually just finished planning. We're going to go to China this summer.
Oh, great. I'd like to know what you are taking in high school as a major. What is your interest in your future?
Okay, so she asked what I had planned for my future. I have no idea. I have no idea whatsoever. I'll have it figured out by the time I get there. But right now, I have some very diverse and varied ambitions, such as becoming Batman, or becoming the president. I'm not sure which one of those I'll go for. There are others too. Any more? Yes?
How long was your trip?
We actually spent 2 weeks in Europe, and then a year later we spent 2 weeks in the Middle East. Yes?
What are the basic tenets of Muhammad?
Excuse me, what did you?
The basic
What are the basic tenets of Muhammad?
Oh, of Muhammad, the pillars of Islam. The pillars of Islam, I recall us learning this in a certain history class with a certain Mr. Nagus not that long ago. Anyway, the pillars of Islam, he asked, are prayer, fasting during Ramadan, Hajj, which is a pilgrimage, prayer, fasting during Ramadan, Hajj, the profession of faith, and almsgiving. Thanks. Anyone else? Anyone else? Is there any questions that you have? I mean, don't think I'm keeping you here. You could leave if you want, but I'm here if you have any questions. Yes?
Any reference to charity? Muhammad.
Excuse me? Almsgiving. Thank you very much for coming, everyone. You can't do that. Yeah, with those, you can't. Oh, thank you very much. I'm honored. I'll be happy to come back whenever you want me to. Okay.